but, one of the very first. Indy 500 was released in 1977. This is actually a launch title for the Atari 2600. Included with each game was a special set of driving controllers. That's pretty cool, especially back then. This is about as close as you could get, in the home arcade. Now, you may wonder why I'm not actually racing any particular person. That's because, unfortunately, I didn't have a friend to grab here, and this game didn't actually have any computer-controlled opponents, and so I'm basically running practice runs here. Another thing I really liked about it is that there's a little bit of variety in the tracks. For instance, you see ice that I'm sliding around. Rally X was released in 1980 by Namco and actually runs on the Pac-Man hardware. This was the first game to ever feature a bonus round, believe it or not. It was also the first game to feature background music. Sega released the game Turbo in 1981 and changed the driving genre forever. Now, several games at the time were trying to emulate driving for the player. They would include things like a steering wheel or maybe a gas or brake pedal, but what was View, right behind the racer format. So in 1982, a ton of gamers like myself were playing the awesome Pole Position. This is another game that, doesn't necessarily hold up very well today, but back in 1982, these graphics were shockingly realistic, and this was super fast to play, super fun. This is a total classic. As a matter of fact, this game was so popular, it was actually featured in the music video for Judas Priest's Free Will Burnin'. Oh yeah, I love that song. And it actually even had its own Saturday morning cartoon. In 1983, Activision released Enduro for the Atari 2600, and this is considered another classic. This is all about endurance. The object of the race is to pass a certain amount of cars each day. Doing so will allow the player to continue racing until the next day. The driver must avoid other racers and pass, I believe it's 200 cars on the first day and 300 on each additional day. You notice here there's even different weather effects and night and day. It was pretty cool at the time. Now, back on the Commodore 64, you had a game called Pit Stop by Epyx. This was released in 1983, and this is kind of like a clone of Pole Position. Although, what was really cool about it, it was the very first game to feature head-to-head split screen. Another kind of nod to realism was that the driver needed to keep an eye on their tires and also their fuel gauge. So you would have to pull into a pit stop, hence the name, to either change the tire or quickly refuel. So up to this point, I've pretty much just highlighted cars. But back in 1984, Nintendo released Excitebike, and it was an awesome racer. Excitebike was a launch title for the brand new Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. The game was notable for its kind of pseudo 3D graphics, its super fast racing, really tight controls, and actually it had a pretty robust track editor. Now, a personal favorite of mine on the Commodore 64 was Buggy Boy, released in 1985 by Tatsumi. This is a port of an arcade game, and actually the Commodore 64 port was pretty warmly well received by the video game press, and it actually became one of the most popular racers on that platform. However, the original arcade version of it had a cockpit, and what was really cool about it is that it had a panoramic 3-screen display. So another automobile racing game I just had to show is the classic Sega Hang-On, released in 1985. Now, Hang-On was a pretty groundbreaking game in a lot of ways. The graphics are awesome, the speed is just intense, but most gamers like me remember that it was the world's first kind of full-body experience video game. Now, what I mean by that is, if you happen to live next to an arcade that had the full experience, what you got to do as a gamer was actually sit on a mock-up of a real sort of, crotch rocket, and essentially you would turn using your whole body. You would lean the motorcycle to the left or to the right. I mean, it was just an incredible sense of control, and, if you can't tell already, I just love this game. In 1985, Activision released a pretty interesting racing game called The Great American Cross Country Road Race. The game kind of reminds me actually of the Cannonball Run. In the game, you race across the United States while passing through, most major cities. The game was known for having several obstacles that the player must watch out for, such as weather, road conditions, you would need to refuel your gas, and there was, of course, the cops. You even had to shift gears while watching your tachometer. And you could actually blow your engine if you pushed it too hard, and then you'd have to get out and push your car to the nearest gas station for repairs. Sega created one of the decade's most popular racing games in 1986 called Outrun. It was notable for its innovative hardware, including a moving cabinet. It had stellar graphics and a peppy soundtrack. And choice was a big part of Outrun, as you could choose which songs you wanted to listen to and even the route you wanted to take. I think for me, Outrun seemed to capture the joy of racing really well. I mean, you're in a convertible Ferrari. It looks like you're in, I don't know, Florida or maybe California, and you've got this hot blonde as a passenger. It's awesome. In 1986, Atari did something very cool with Super Sprint. They basically went back and updated the very first racing game ever, Grand Track 10. Now, obviously, the graphics are much improved and probably top of the line for 1986, but they really, kept the heart and feel of that game with this, and, that's because it is a great game. I mean, it's a classic. As a matter of fact, other games have actually included this as mini-games in them, including Jet Force Gemini and The Simpsons Hit and Run. In 1987, Atari gave us a futuristic rally race game with weapons called Road Blasters. Now, I know this game is different than all the other games on the list, but it was so popular that I just felt like I needed to show it. And it's fairly similar in that you have to watch your fuel. That's what I'm collecting on the ground there. And then you basically just battle these cars and try to get to the end of the course before all your fuel runs out. Occasionally, a special supply ship will fly over and drop a special weapon, which is pretty handy. Home consoles didn't have a lot of power in the 80s for, really good racing. Test Drive was released by Accolade in 1987, and I'm showing you the Commodore 64 version here, which is the one that I own. Now, at the time, this was supposed to be kind of like a simulator, and so I thought it was pretty cool because it allowed you to actually choose to drive a Lamborghini Countach, which is my favorite, a Ferrari, a Lotus, a Porsche, or even a Corvette. Now, what you're watching here is the poor Commodore 64 desperately trying to pump out some real kind of 3D graphics, but man, you can tell the frame rate's just terrible. But at the time, it was pretty groundbreaking. RC Pro-Am is a well-loved game by Rare for the NES and one of the first racing games to incorporate the use of weapons to temporarily disable competitors. The missiles, bombs, and more that are in RC Pro-Am were later replicated in such 1990s hits as Revolt, Rock and Roll Racing, and yes, even Mario Kart. It all started here. Chase HQ, released by Taito in 1988, was another game I just had to include in here, even though it's a little bit different than some of the others. In this game, you play as a cop chasing down 6 different villains. This game was such a huge success worldwide that it was eventually ported over to 15 different home computers and consoles. And now we come to my final game, which is called Hard Drivin'. In 1989, Atari released the world's first 3D polygon driving game with a realistic manual transmission mode that included a clutch and the possibility of stalling out the car should the player misshift. And if that wasn't even enough, it had a force feedback steering wheel. Very cool. This really was the first true attempt to seriously model real-world physics in a driving game. I mean, it's kind of amazing that Atari sort of started the racing genre way back in the early 70s, and then at the end of the 80s, redefined it yet again.